would like to welcome you tonight on behalf of all the Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights members. Welcome online.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Mr. Jones, you have been working on human rights and refugee protections issues for almost a decade. As you know, coronavirus COVID-19 presents uh, a serious threat to prisoners detained in the overcrowded detention centers in Bahrain, not to mention the lack of proper hygiene conditions even before the pandemic. Would you please explain more how the prisoners are under more risk to contact the virus?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. And so I think, the buzzword around the world at the moment is lockdown. I mean, we have airports on lockdown, countries, states, territories, cities, even villages. But I think one of the most important things for us to consider is what about those populations that are actually in lockdown, that are actually in prisons, in the truest sense of the word. And especially in the case, like you mentioned, in Bahrain, they're really just petri dishes waiting for the virus to take hold. And that's especially the case in many prisons across the country. Outside, people who aren't detained, we have the luxury of many things. We have the luxury of food delivery, of hand gels, of sanitizing wipes, clean bathrooms, and social distancing, being able to keep ourselves separate from other people, which is one thing that specifically, especially in the context of overcrowded and unhygienic conditions in Bahraini prisons, is not possible. The CDC, the US Center for Disease Control, has specifically mentioned about people over the age of 60 and also those in poor health who have pre-existing conditions that are at heightened risk of contracting the coronavirus. And I think really compounding these vulnerable factors plus poor hygiene and tight living conditions in Bahrain prisons, I think it's really a recipe for disaster. And there are many human rights defenders and opposition activists, opposition leaders in Bahrain who fall into this category. So we have Abdul Wahad Hussein, 66 years old, detained for life. We have Abdul Hadi Al-Khawija, 59 years old, same thing, detained for life. And Dr. Abdel Jalil, also 58 years old and disabled, detained for life. And so I think it's something which really needs to be paid close attention to.
Yes, yes. Your answer drive me to ask you this question. Bahrain's authorities are neglecting the prisoners' safety and well-being by insisting on holding them in such condition. For example, Hassan Mushaima, the Secretary General of Al-Haq movement, is 72 years old and suffers from chronic illness, high pressure, diabetes, and remissions of lymphoma. He was denied his medications and regular tests more than once. He is also serving a life sentence since 2011. Can you please explain how is that considered a violation to their human rights?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note from the outset that prisoners are not excluded from the right to enjoyment to health. The right to health is a human right that's available to everybody, regardless of whether or not you're incarcerated or not. And that includes the prevention, treatment, and also the control of diseases. And so specifically in the Bahrain context, there is a right, and so it's without discrimination of any kind, the right to health. And that's contained in the ICESCR, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And Bahrain has acceded to this convention in 2008. Aside from that, there's also the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, known as the Nelson Mandela Rules. And so this document, it was adopted by the General Assembly in 2015, and it contains 122 principles of things that must be observed for prisoners. So there's a couple, there's respect for prisoners, there's a prohibition of torture, there's responding to individual needs of vulnerable persons, and interestingly, there's 11 specific rules which articulate the access and the right to healthcare. Lastly, Bahrain's treatment also infringes upon another international convention, and that is a Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. And there are 7 articles in there that specifically reference the prohibition of torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, freedom of expression, security of person, and the need to be treated with humanity. And all of these encompass access to healthcare. And Bahrain ratified this convention in 2006.
Yes, unfortunately, you can't solve the human rights folders without find a permanent solution for a political crisis in Bahrain. Mm-hmm. So what is your message tonight for the Bahraini government and the international community, especially Bahrainis allies?
Yep. I mean, it's a very simple message, really. And the top line is that COVID-19 is a global pandemic, plain and simple. And now is the time where we can't turn the other way. We can't ignore what's happening, and we can't avoid what's right in front of our faces. So I'll break it down. So to allied states, I think it's really the onus is upon them to raise their voices and to not stay silent at this time. In this situation, I think silence would almost be the equivalence of complicity. And so they need to mobilize their resources, and they need to speak to their counterparts in Myanmar to ensure that this crisis does not go unaddressed. To the Bahrain government, the obvious message is to release all of Bahrain's political prisoners, full stop. But I just want to make, put a small caveat in that this is not about political pressure. This is not about pressuring the Bahrain government to adhere to our standards. It's really about human decency. It's about life and death, and it's about providing essential healthcare and protections to individuals inside Bahrain's borders. And I think during this time, not just Bahrain, but all countries around the world will be viewed by how we treat our country's most vulnerable and most marginalized. And in this case, it's Bahrain's prison population. And so I call for the release of all political prisoners, particularly, as I said, the most vulnerable, those over 60, those who are sick, those who are awaiting trial, and those who have sentences which are ending quite soon. And I think, these are not lofty claims. These are not unattainable. They're simple, they're practical, and they're life-saving. Human rights are indivisible, they're universal, and to put it quite simply, they can't stop at the cell door. They can't stop at the gates of the prison, and they can't stop according to anyone's political beliefs.
Thank you very much for accepting our interview for tonight, and it's a pleasure to meet you. And I hope your voice will reach the Bahrainis government, and will find a solution about the prisoners. And thank you very much indeed.
Likewise, thank you very much for having me and for giving me this opportunity to contribute to such a great and really meaningful and important initiative.